It's the Dark Reading News Desk. I'm Terry Sweeney, contributing editor with Dark Reading, and I'm joined now by Brian Dye, Chief Products Officer with Corelight. Brian, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for carving the time, Terry. Been looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, so threat hunting is obviously a really hot topic in the security industry right now. Let's start with exactly what threat hunting is and how it may differ from something like incident response.
It's the right place to start. I mean, in a nutshell, IR is starting with what you know, right? You have an alert, you have an IOC, you have a thread to pull on to go and investigate. Threat hunting is starting with a question. It's a thesis, something you need to understand. That's the big difference.
It feels a bit more proactive in its nature, as opposed to we're going to go out and discover something that's happened or...
Absolutely the case, right?
Yeah.
Because you're hunting for something that by definition, your existing controls, your existing detection technologies have not found. So you're consciously looking for the unknown, hence definitely proactive.
What is your sense of why threat hunting has captured the attention of so many security professionals now? Like is there some trigger point or some inflection point that we're at that makes this especially useful now?
You know, I give a lot of credit to both NIST and SANS in this case, because as the NIST framework came out, everybody was forced to acknowledge that my perimeter protections aren't perfect and I need to have a backdrop of detection. And the moment they said that, they're like, wait a minute, what if my detections aren't perfect? What's the next line of defense behind that?
Okay.
So it's a natural thinking that led us to threat hunting. And you know, part of the reason I give SANS some credit is they actually had their first threat hunting class in 2016. And that's a great leading indicator of kind of awareness is when SANS starts teaching the training courses on.
Okay, kind of a barometer of where the practice is heading.
Yeah, because otherwise you've got to talk to your friends to find out what this thing is and kind of learn the best practices, right? So codifying it at SANS, I give a lot of credit to.
So speaking of best practices, what are some tips that you typically offer to organizations that are looking to up their game here?
You know, I just give two. I mean, number one is no matter how big or small you are, do it. Some folks in really large orgs, that's a team. Some folks, it's 3 hours out of a person's time every week. But no matter what scale you're on, invest some time in it. And the reason is that worst case scenario, you'll know your network better, right? Even if you only get a couple hours a week,
Sure.
You'll still know something, right? So there's value in this for kind of at every scale. And the second one, especially if you're at a bigger organization, you're thinking about kind of org structure and org design, you got to think about whether threat hunting is a different team, is it a career path, or is it a part of people's time? And there's pros and cons of that given how you're running the rest of your security operations center. So that's the other big topic we talk about.
So prospective customers shouldn't be put off by like a big budgetary spend or a huge additional workload.
Absolutely, because if you think about, it's kind of like going for a jog. The only thing you need for a jog is a pair of sneakers. The only thing you need to get started on threat hunting is a question. And everyone's got questions. And there's actually great resources. We actually have one available on our website that's a threat hunting guide, right? For different views of the network, here are questions you should ask of whatever data you happen to have. So it really doesn't cost anything to get going.
Okay, so in this spy versus spy industry that we work in, hackers are grabbing onto threat hunting tools as well. What are you seeing there?
Well, we see the cat and mouse game progressing, right?
Sure.
And I think a really interesting area is encrypted traffic, because you know the attackers have been trying to hide their techniques in encrypted data recently, or encrypted communications. And so a great example of this, there's some really cool research that came out of the Salesforce.com security engineering team, where they figured out that if you fingerprint the certificate handshake, there's enough degrees of freedom to find the attacker tool, right?
Wow.
You can say, oh, you're using Metasploit. That's a pretty durable piece of insight, right? Because if you find an IP address, very low half-life, not super useful. You find the tool, you've really thrown them a curveball. And so now what we find is attackers are trying to play the cat and mouse game by, oh, let's do pre-shared keys. So that way you can't fingerprint that connection. Well, we've just figured out how to actually find things that are doing encrypted communications with pre-shared keys.
Okay.
So if you can find the original detection and the countermeasure, you can help hunters get both ends of that spectrum.
Okay, I mean, this is starting to sound like a plot for a new TV crime series. Any recent real-life anecdotes to share around that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the great thing about our industry. So many anecdotes. You know, we worked with a customer that on the very first day that we got deployed with them, they found reverse shell activity happening from China over SSH.
Okay.
And that's fine unless you don't have a data center in China and you're not employing any administrators
Might be
in
a
China.
problem.
That is a sign of an indicator, right? And it's not just cyber that's so interesting, and that's why I think threat hunting as a discipline has so much power. Another organization we worked with, they realized that they had whole chunks of their database estate that was sending unencrypted SQL queries from their databases. That's not an attack, but it sure as heck is a pretty big vulnerability and a pretty bad operating practice. So you know, you're going to find stuff when you go threat hunting. Maybe it's a bad policy, maybe it's a misconfiguration, maybe it's an actual attack, but you're going to be better off no matter which one of those you wind up finding.
Any other examples of weird use of encryption that you're seeing that may prove worrisome?
Yeah, so there's a lot going on in the encrypted world. I think a lot of what folks are starting to think about now is what does my world look like when people start to do DNS over encrypted communication channels like HTTPS or TLS. So being able to find that, first and foremost, we think is going to be really interesting. The other thing that we found when we started looking at encryption is it's not as binary, no pun intended, as you might think. So when we started looking at real production environments, we saw that folks had things that the port and protocol claimed were encrypted. The protocol is an encrypted protocol. And then they would have huge chunks of clear text happening in the middle of it. At the very least, that's odd and deserves some follow-up. So what we're finding overall on encryption is that it's hiding some things, but then revealing others. And it's been a really interesting thread to pull on. And I think threat hunters, as they look in their own environments, are going to find a lot in there as well.
Is it fair to say that any unexpected encryption is basically a red flag for threat hunters?
Yes, I mean, things like pre-shared keys, that is definitely a red flag. Weird behavior over things that should be encrypted is a red flag. And in cases where you've got, the other interesting one we found is things that are not encrypted, at least the protocol is not encrypted, but the content is all clearly obfuscated. So they're essentially trying to get the benefits of encryption without actually revealing any of the additional analysis that encrypted traffic normally undergoes. So it's the cat and mouse game of, you know, investigatory insight, evasion, countermeasure.
Right.
It's absolutely continuing in the encryption world.
Rinse and repeat.
Yes.
So with the advent of cloud, does this help or hurt the threat hunter cause?
You know, it does both. It helps because there's a bunch of new data sources, right? So in AWS, you've got your CloudTrail logs. That's a new great source of data for people to dive into. In networking up until recently, it's actually really hurt because you haven't been able to get that broad-based visibility. And if you think about a threat hunter's context, there's three main sources of data, right? They want the network for breadth, the endpoint for depth, and threat intel for external context. And if you're missing that middle piece, it's a pretty big gap. So I give a lot of credit to the cloud providers that have figured that out and have taken it seriously. So now you've got things like in AWS, the VPC traffic mirror that kind of gives you that network visibility for threat hunters to use. GCP actually has theirs in beta now. Azure, the last one, is also has one that's actually about to go back into beta. So they're giving us those tools so the threat hunters can get all three parts of the visibility they need.
Well, you've given us plenty to think about with regard to threat hunting and enterprise security, Brian. Thank you.
It's been a ton of fun. Always enjoy the time, Terry.
Great. We've been talking with Brian Dye of Corelight. This has been Terry Sweeney for the Dark Reading News Desk. Thank you for joining us.